Happy Wednesday. I wish I could see all of you and read this with you in person, but we are just going right along. We're at chapter 25 already, where we left off in chapter 24. Brayden is heading towards the graveyard where Serafina is buried, where she escapes from the grave when we started this book. So he's headed there, we don't know why. Chapter 25. Serafina followed Brayden through the forest at a distance, uncertain of how her presence might affect him. That first night she came to him, he had suffered much anguish, like sadness, ultimate sort of pain. She wasn't keen on driving him afoul again, so she let him get a fair piece in front of her. She made her way through the darkened cemetery on her own, following the path that she thought Brayden was on. But she could no longer hear him and Gideon walking ahead of her. Either she let them go too far up the path, or something else had happened, and suddenly she felt very much alone. As she crept past the weathered headstones marking the graves, the graveyard's swampy, moist air clung to her skin like leeches. A lot of times you can find them in watery areas, like a lake. The shallow part of a lake they live in, the dirt, is where I've seen them. They like attached to your skin, and they are what's that called? I can't remember the word. They will try to like live off of your body, so essentially they're, what is that word? Parasite. They're like a parasite. A low chorus of crickets, cicadas, and other buzzing insects pulsed around her. Long wispy trails of mist oozed across the ground at her feet. The twisting roots of the old trees weaved through the damp earth beneath her bare feet, and vines hung down from the trees' crooked, dangling limbs. So this whole paragraph, Robert Beatty's done a really good job of describing the way things look to us, so that we can sense this misty, damp, dark trail that she's on to get to the graveyard. She had already read many of the headstones that were chiseled, having block letters on these gravestones, and she had no desire to do it again tonight, but as she moved among them, the voices of the dead came alive. She's reading these messages that are on each headstone. "Here lies blood, and let it lie, speechless still, and never cry," one said, but she tried not to look or listen. "Our bed is lovely, dark, and sweet. Come join us now, and we shall meet," said the two sisters lying in the ground side by side. It felt as if they were talking to her, inviting her back to where she belonged. She hurried past the cloven man and through the 660 crosses of the buried Confederate soldiers. When she finally made it through the graveyard, she came to a small open area of the Angel's Glade. She found Brayden lying stretched out face down on the dirt mound of her grave. His body was flat to the ground. His left leg was straight, but his right leg was bent beside him, clenched in the metal brace. His arms were up around his head. The fingers of his hands splayed as if he'd been holding the earth. Gideon lay flat on the ground a few feet away, just as still as he. Serafina's heart filled with fear, for it looked like they were both dead. She couldn't breathe. But then Brayden's head moved, and Serafina exhaled in relief. Brayden's eyes were closed, and his face was filled with sadness, but he was alive. He had come to visit her, to sleep there on the ground, stretched out on her grave. She noticed the dried stains on his trousers and the old dirt on his boots. He'd been there before, many times. He hadn't been sneaking out of the house every night to use the black cloak. He'd been coming here. She imagined him coming out here night after night, sleeping on her grave, when his family thought he was home in his bed. Had Mr. Vanderbilt come during the night with a search party and looked upon his nephew in dread? Was that why Mr. Vanderbilt had been so concerned about him? Was that why he told Brayden that he had double-locked Biltmore's doors? As Brayden lay on her grave, his shoulders moved with a slow and troubled breathing. She gazed upon him in sadness, pursing her lips as she felt a thickness coating in her throat. She's got that feeling right before you're about to cry. Sometimes your throat gets really tight, and it feels like there's this, I don't know, like a lump in it. For a long time, he did not speak or move from the grave. He just lay there in the dirt. It was as if his thoughts had overwhelmed him and he'd collapsed there. She moved closer to him, her chest rising and falling, slow and steady, with every breath she took, and she knelt down beside him. She could see that his hands were trembling. She studied his face and his closed eyes. When he squeezed his eyes shut even tighter, she watched a tear roll down his cheek, fall, and drop into the dirt. Tiny specks of dust floated into the air around where the tear fell. She pulled in a sudden breath, heaving full of emotion, and tried to let it out with a measured calm, but her sigh was ragged, it was rough, it wasn't steady. When he finally lifted his face, he looked up at the stone angel and said, "I gave her to you." His voice was shaking. "But what have you done?" Serafina felt a storm of dizziness passing through her. Tears welled up in her eyes. As she looked around the gravesite, she noticed that the mound of dirt he was lying on seemed strangely undisturbed. She was surprised that the broken boards of the coffin weren't sticking up out of the ground where she had crawled out. "What do you want me to do?" Brayden shouted desperately at the angel. "Tell me what to do." She wished she could reach out to him, somehow touch him, somehow talk to him. "I'm here, Brayden," she said. "I'm here." She put her hand on his. She could not truly feel the living warmth of his hand, and it was clear that he could not feel her, but the closeness of her spirit seemed to rack him with new grief. His face contorted with a dark and terrible sorrow. Horrified by what she was doing to him, she quickly rose to her feet and stepped back. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was weak. "I'm not going to leave you, Serafina," he said, getting himself up to his feet. "I'm not going to abandon you." He hadn't heard her words, but he was still speaking to her in the grave, and it pulled at her heart. She desperately wanted to show him a sign that she had heard him. No matter what had happened, they were still friends. They were still together. Her death wasn't going to be the end of them. It couldn't be. She looked around her, determined to find a way to communicate with him. Dust to dust, she thought. Of earth they were made, and into earth they return. That was what was happening to her. She was returning. But for the moment, there was still a little trace of her that lingered in the world. Harmless as a fly, Serafina thought. But even a fly can do things, and now she had an idea. Wanting to make as big a movement as possible, she stepped onto the mound of the grave and spun around in a circle, shouting and kicking, jumping up and down, trying to make every kind of wild commotion she possibly could. But nothing happened. The dirt didn't move. She was useless. But then she remembered. Play the flute. She got down onto her hands and knees, leaned down, pulled some air into her lungs, and blew out a gentle, perfect breath, just like she'd practiced. Suddenly, a tiny flurry of dust swirled up in the moonlight in front of Brayden. She cheered with a great shout. She'd done it just the way she'd practiced and just at the right moment. But Brayden did not see anything. More discouraged than ever, she flopped to the ground. The whole thing was hopeless. But then she noticed that Gideon had sat up and was looking in her direction. His ears were perked and his eyes alert. He wasn't looking at her, but at the dust she had stirred. Brayden can't see it, but Gideon noticed. He was staring straight at it. He tilted his head quizzically. "It's me, Gideon," she shouted. She blew into the dirt again, and then another little cloud of dust curled up. Gideon rose slowly to his 4 feet. He tilted his head, trying to understand what he was seeing. "I'm alive, Gideon," she shouted. Finally, Gideon barked in recognition, and then he started digging. Serafina pulled back in surprise, startled. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting, but she definitely didn't think the silly dog would dig. Don't forget where they are. A graveyard. If he digs, he's gonna see a coffin. But she didn't know how to stop him. Gideon dug furiously with his front paws, throwing a rooster tail of dirt behind him. Startled and spitting out the flying dirt hitting his face, Brayden scrambled out of the way. "What's going on?" he asked in confusion. "What are you doing, boy?" But Gideon just kept digging straight down into Serafina's grave, throwing dirt like he was a steam-powered digging machine. "Stop, Gideon. Don't," Brayden commanded him. He grabbed the dog by the shoulders and tried to hold him back, but the boy was no match for the dog's strength. "What are you doing?" Brayden demanded, his voice filled with worry and fear. "Don't do this. We can't do this." Serafina knew he was scared of what anyone would be scared of digging up a grave, that he'd find her grotesque, putrefied body. But Gideon didn't stop. He just kept digging. Brayden stepped back, obviously unsure of what to do. He watched as his dog dug deeper and deeper into the hole. Serafina could tell by the horrified look on Brayden's face that he didn't think he was prepared to see what he was about to see, and yet, at the same time, there was something tearing at him. Maybe curiosity? Some overwhelming desire for Gideon to keep going. They had to change the dark and terrible world they'd been living in. They had to do something, and now Gideon was doing it. Brayden dropped down to his knees and started digging at Gideon's side. He clawed rapidly at the earth, with his bare hands throwing the dirt behind him. Notice how Brayden has changed by watching Gideon's bravery. And I know that he's a dog, but still, he was stepping back. He was very timid, very cautious. And now he's joining Gideon, going with the same rapid, quick pace. Serafina didn't know what they were going to find in the grave. Would there be an actual body? But she'd crawled out. She'd been walking through the world. There couldn't be a body in the grave. But was there? Were they gonna find her corpse rotting in the dirt? She could imagine her gray, decaying skin hanging from the broken white bones of her earthly remains. When Brayden and Gideon finally reached the coffin, Serafina was surprised to see that the lid was unbroken and still in place. Brushing aside the last of the dirt, Brayden pried the coffin's lid away. Serafina gasped in astonishment of what she saw. Another cliffhanger. You'll have to wait till tomorrow to see what happens in chapter 26, what they see. Or I guess Serafina's the one gasping in astonishment, so what she sees when they look inside her coffin. I'm not going to ask you a question today. I hope you enjoyed listening to chapter 25. And if you have any reactions, any questions about the chapter, write them in the comments below and I will respond to you. I miss you and I hope you're having a great Wednesday.